In August of 2010, in the lead-up promotion to the live-action film Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, Adult Swim released Scott Pilgrim the Animation, a 3.5-minute short that served as a prequel to the film based on the first few pages of Bryan Lee O'Malley's second Scott Pilgrim book. For 13 years, I kept that short bit of animation in my head and dreamed about a complete animated take on Scott Pilgrim. The live-action film is beloved, sure, but was in production before the books had even concluded, plus it had to cram 6 graphic novels into a 2-hour feature. I always believed an animated series would be the perfect medium for adapting Scott Pilgrim. Give it the space to breathe, properly adapt the summer saga that was book 4, give the Kadiyanagi twins more than 3 minutes of screen time, maybe some lines even, show us Knives' father, Lisa, Joseph, and everything else that didn't make it into the film. In 2022, a Scott Pilgrim anime project was announced, and now, in 2023, the nearly 20-year-old comic inspired by retro games, kung fu films, and battle anime has been adapted into all three, a game, a film, and an anime. It would seem the 2010 version of me got what I always dreamed of. Well, sort of. Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is not the beat-for-beat faithful adaptation of the 6-volume graphic novel run. It's also not the 2010 Edgar Wright film, nor is it an animated retelling of Ubisoft's beat-em-up game. Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is very much its own thing, but not just that. Compared to the other adaptations, Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is indisputably the biggest departure from Bryan Lee O'Malley's original work yet. But at the same time, O'Malley is the showrunner, writer, and executive producer on Takes Off. This isn't Science Saru, the brilliant animation studio behind Devilman Crybaby, Keep Your Hands Off Aizoken, Tatami Time Machine Blues, and more, arrogantly believing they could improve O'Malley's original story. These changes are all Bryan throwing audiences for a deliberate, strategic loop, whether we asked for it or not. This video is meant to be as spoiler-free as possible, but know that episode 1 of Takes Off is a near-identical retelling of the events of the first book up until the last 30 seconds of the episode, where a landmark event in the story we expect to play out a certain way goes in the complete opposite direction. From there, with this one fundamental truth about the story of Scott Pilgrim having been shattered, the story spirals into the strange, familiar but unknown, and entirely unpredictable. I'll be the first to admit this shakeup at the end of episode 1, as well as the aftermath and deviation from events seen in episode 2, it left me feeling weird, disoriented, and for a moment even disappointed when it became clear this wasn't the one-for-one retelling that I dreamed of for 13 years. Suddenly what Edgar Wright said all made sense when he said the new series was neither a straight adaptation of the books nor the film and was something else. So what is it? I'm not looking to give away the twist of the first episode's ending here, but what I can comfortably say is that Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is an author returning to his most famous creation 2 decades later and examining why people around the globe fell in love with its characters. O'Malley is not angry at or tired of his creations, but he's offering them a new set of circumstances to explore and shine in. I believe he looked at characters like Ramona, like Lucas Lee, like Julie, and saw gaps in their previous iterations that could be filled. Areas where they could be expanded on, made to be more than dream girls, nightmare exes, and scary friends of friends. And in the same way that Scott Pilgrim was inspired by the greatest video game and anime stories of the 80s and 90s, I believe O'Malley was once again inspired by some of the greatest video game and anime projects of the 2010s and 2020s, specifically the Final Fantasy VII Remake and the rebuild of Evangelion projects. For the uninitiated, just like Scott Pilgrim Takes Off, both of these projects were initially marketed to the world as modern remakes of classic works, both with the original creators Hideaki Anno for Eva and Tetsuya Nomura for Final Fantasy VII still involved. When those projects released, it became clear that they weren't simple remakes and retellings, with sometimes subtle, other times world-changing differences appearing throughout the new versions. And just like with Scott Pilgrim Takes Off, there was some initial turbulence with the release of Final Fantasy VII Remake, with some fans unsure about the changes and preferring a beat-for-beat remake of the PlayStation 1 game, but in no time at all, because of the quality of the new products, the passion on display, the commitment to the changes, and again, with the original creatives at the helm, it became harder and harder to deny these projects were endlessly more fascinating than a simple remake would have been. Rebuild of Evangelion and Final Fantasy VII Remake became these meditations on the original text. Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is doing the same thing, an analysis of the story, its characters, fans' relationship to the story and characters, a new outlet for the original creator to express any thoughts that didn't make it into the original, or maybe even regrets they may have been carrying for a decade plus. Each of these is distinctly not a remake, not quite a sequel either, but something combining these two concepts. Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is not a simple retelling with the stunning animation of Science Saru, the sounds of Anamanaguchi and the cast of the movie voicing the lines, I personally began to accept that with one specific scene in episode 3. The only scene I'll explicitly discuss here, as on its own I don't consider this a spoiler. In Scott Pilgrim Takes Off, Knives is learning to play the bass. She's going through a hard time and Kim recognizes this. Kim asks Knives if she wants to jam, helping Knives, and herself too certainly, to work through their feelings with the healing power of music. It's so obvious from the scene with its stunning animation and beautifully true to life sounds that O'Malley believes in what he's writing. Knives plays the bass at a perfectly believable skill level for someone who only recently picked up the instrument, showing talent but clearly new and improvising. Kim, for all the rage and apathy we think of when we picture that character, she delivers this wonderfully laid back drum beat that isn't overpowering Knives' bass playing but is supportive and responsive. It's an incredible new scene for Kim's character and a real gift from O'Malley to the audience. This is when the new show officially clicked for me. Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is a series of new and surprising gifts to fans of this world. New dynamics, new plot lines, characters that never interacted or hardly interacted in the original story are given full scenes to connect. Young Neil and Ramona chatting, Knives and Kim jamming, Julie and her dynamic with a character she never interacted with in the original, who I don't want to spoil here. I saw someone in the comments of an IGN review, Motor Dan, describe Scott Pilgrim Takes Off quite perfectly. He said, "The series feels like a new game plus with a subsequent true ending." There's also a bit of Nier Automata going on here in Takes Off. We're playing through the story we thought we knew, but with a new set of eyes and from a different perspective. It's also funny because in a way, Ubisoft's Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, the game, did something similar to Takes Off when it released back in 2010. We all know the story is that Scott defeats Ramona's 7 evil exes, but if you wanted to, you could play through that game defeating Ramona's evil exes as Kim, as Steven, Knives, even as Ramona herself. Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is simultaneously doing something brand new, but also nothing new at all. All of our players are here, the evil exes are present, Toronto, Ontario is our iconic backdrop, and Bryan Lee O'Malley is writing it all with the sincerity and love for the source material that I think is only possible from the original author with 20 years of growth and reflection behind him. O'Malley and crew have had a chance to tell the original story 3 times now already with the comic, the film, and the game. 4 or 5 times debatably if you include the full color edition graphic novel from the 2010s and the complete edition of the game that re-released in 2021. I think Bryan and all of his collaborators, Anamanaguchi, Edgar Wright, Michael Cera, Mary Elizabeth Winstead, and the rest of the returning cast, I think they more than earned the right to do something new with Scott Pilgrim. While I'd be lying if I said it doesn't sting a bit that I don't have a new definitive version of Scott Pilgrim to recommend to newcomers, because I'm not sure if the story works standalone without having experienced the original books or the film, I'm beyond thrilled that Scott Pilgrim Takes Off gave us the world-expanding quasi-sequel I never knew I needed.
What's a girl to do?